Welcome, everybody. We're now on short on seeing as well as being present, but at least I have a few faces to look at, and I will imagine the rest of you. Strange title, ominous title, yes, the end of the world, and then a touch of optimism beyond the end of the world, which is of course a paradox. If the world is really ending, as we sometimes tend to feel, particularly in these times perhaps, we feel that apocalypse has arrived, that everything is so much changed, that the order of the world has changed so radically that it's hard to imagine how it's ever going to get back to normal. And perhaps it's not. Perhaps it really is an ending. And so I wanted to contemplate what the feeling is, what the emotion, what the spiritual reality of a sense that the world has come to an end. It's pretty grim. I often talk to people who are really suffering in this way. And it's led me to think more about the issue. I realized one of my associations with the expression the end of the world, or the world come to an end, is to say it's not the end of the world. That is, I think it's a rather, it's an expression that I tend to use, or I used to tend to use in less serious times. I would say about something that struck me as very serious and catastrophic, I would comfort myself and comfort others by saying, that's not the end of the world. By which I mean, keep things in proportion. Keep things in proportion. You don't have to get so upset about this. It's not order of magnitude to call it the end of the world. Until I had a phone call from a student, a past student from Pittsburgh, who had gone through the massacre and had been very personally involved in it, and who spoke about how she feels that the world has come to an end. And of course, that's when you say that, then the other person has to begin to use their imagination. Then I have to begin to understand what she means by that. She wasn't personally injured, but her world came to an end. And that sense, the sense of an ending, I've called this class as the first of three classes that have to do with beyond the end of the world, the end of the year, the end of the Torah, right? We're in a time of endings, some of them innocent, some of them obviously to be followed by beginnings, right? You get to the end of the year and then the new year begins. The clock ticks, tick tock, tick tock. I took the title, The Sense of an Ending, actually, from a very well-known book by a great English literary critic, Frank Kermode. He has a book about apocalypse that he calls The Sense of an Ending. Apocalypse and how novels end, how fictions end. He wants to talk about the importance of what you expect to be the ending of the story when you're in the middle of it. When you're still in the middle, it's a great help to sanity. It's a great help to your sense of order, to have a feeling of expectation of how the thing is it going to have a happy ending? Is it going to have an unhappy ending? That has an inordinate importance for us, in a sense. More important than how things will begin. Because everyone knows how things begin. Things begin in a rather raw state, not fully accomplished. But the ending is important to us. And I will confess, I don't think I'm the only person, to having a quick look at the end of a book as I'm starting it, particularly if I'm feeling very, very sensitive for some reason. And I feel this book is going to really penetrate me, then I have a quick look just to make sure that somehow I can bear this. Well, that kind of ending, the ending that we expect, is one thing. But there is another kind of ending by which really we usually are thinking of that when we think of apocalypse or tragic moments, catastrophes, that seem literally to bring the world to an end. And that, in a way, is the opposite of the fiction of an ending. Right? This is not a fictional ending, on the contrary. This is an experience of brute reality, bursting in on one's orderly world, that one has a nice, story of a life. As we are living, we have a certain story. We know how we do things. We know how things are organized, what produces what results. And with that orderly world, we then are suddenly invaded by some event that seems, perhaps in reality, objective reality, to put an end to all that order, or sometimes a personal sense of a radical disaster. That is, it may not objectively be the end of the world, but for me, it's the end of the world. That something has happened that has torn my life apart. Now, there's a very poignant Hebrew expression for this, it's a midrashic, Talmudic expression. Charav alav olamo. His world collapsed. His world fell into ruins. Now, that's his world, talking about a particular person. But a person also has a world which is not exactly the same as the objective world. And we don't realize how much we depend on certain kingpins of order, certain structures and infrastructures that hold our world together until they disappear, until the beloved one is no longer there, who is not only beloved, but gives meaning to life. That's the most obviously tragic example. But there are many examples of this. On the objective side, there is Noah and the flood. The world came to an end. That's very clear. And Noah is described in the Midrash as someone who ra'a olam chadash. He's one of those unique people, very rare, it doesn't happen very often, who get to see a new world. That is, they survive the ending of a world, and they go on to see a different world, olam chadash. And we don't get to know immediately whether it's a better world or a worse world. Now, we hope it's a better world, but it's certainly new, it's different. And that is Noah, and Noah is really a rare example. There are a few examples given in the Midrash of people who had such an experience. For instance, Yosef, who started off as a slave, well, it depends where you start his story, and ended up as king of Egypt. Yeah. Or who else? Eov, Job, yeah, who saw his whole world collapsing on every level. And then in the end, he had a new family and a new world, and ra'a olam chadash. So there's a certain sense of that as a pattern, that can happen. On the other hand, what I don't want to do is to rush immediately to hopeful, optimistic scenarios. And that's what I hinted at in the description of the series. In each of these three subjects that we'll be talking about, we'll be talking about someone whose personal world has been radically undermined. We start with Moses, with Moshe, and then next week we talk about, I'm sorry, I just had a...
Jonah.
What? Jonah, thank you. Yes, next week is Jonah, who is unaccountably disturbed by God's mission. So much that he feels his world has collapsed that he says in his final dialogue with God, that's at the end of the story, when we would hope for some kind of light to have dawned, he says to God, Tov moti michayei, my death is better than my life. And God has something to say to him to end the book. That is, there is a real question of principle here. There's a question, as far as Jonah is concerned, death is better than, question mark, the existing state of things, what you want me to do. And it's, of course, the mystery of the book. That's the irrationality of the book. And the third class will be about the aftermath of the golden calf, which also, in its way, was truly catastrophic. So I want to dive now into the story of Moshe. And I want to suggest that the moment at which Moshe's life, as he had imagined it, as he had expected it all along, is brought to an abrupt ending, when God tells him, you will not cross over and you will not see that good land. Now, of course, God has already told him that. This is not the first time Moshe hears about this. He tells him at the end of the book of Numbers, after the story of the striking of the rock, if you remember, he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. Well, that's one attempt at a diagnosis. What was it that Moshe did to deserve what God then pronounces, which is that you will not lead this people because of what just happened? And there's something mysterious about that whole passage that we can't really get settled in our mind about what is the logic of this doom that suddenly Moshe. And we don't hear any protest from him at that point until now, suddenly, in the third verse of the book of Deuteronomy, in the third chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, we read about this prayer that Moshe made to God at that time, he says. He's talking to the people, and he is narrating to the people the story of a prayer that he made to God, that there should be a reprieve from that doom ending of his story. And God answers him, and I read now the skeleton of the scene here. Va'et Hanan el Hashem, I beseeched God, chapter 3, verse 23. It's not on your source page. I beseeched God at that time, saying, and there are some words of praise for God, because that's how you begin a prayer formally. Then the actual prayer. E'ebrana ve'ereh. Let me please cross over, la'avor. Let me cross over, please, a kind of double please there, the ending of e'ebra and na. And let me see that good land, which is on the other side of the Jordan, that good mountain and Lebanon. Now, here is his plea. Let me cross over and see. On the other side. The other side is what I want to cross towards. Ever Ebron. The other side of the river Jordan. So he wants to cross the river. It has a geographical meaning. And then suddenly we read, Vayitaber Hashem bi lemanchem. And God was furious with me for your sake, because of you. He's addressing the people. And he's saying to them, it's something to do with you. God was furious with me, and it has something to do with you. Now, that is, first of all, mysterious. Has that to do with you? But more than that, there is the question of God's anger here. Why is God so very angry? So angry, in fact, that he doesn't let Moshe talk, that he actually interrupts him. It's really a very harsh disruption of Moshe's attempt at a prayer. It's a really unprecedentedly harsh moment. And what we read at this point is, Velo shama elai. He's telling the people, God was angry and he refused to listen to me. Lo shama elai. Now those very simple words, he refused to listen to me, really carry quite a weight. They carry quite a burden. Because Moshe is the person, if you remember, to whom God always listened. Where Moshe had communication problems was with the people. That he often, and with Pharaoh, that when he tried to plead with Pharaoh, Pharaoh wouldn't listen to him. Plague after plague, we read, and Pharaoh didn't listen to him. So clearly that problem of not getting through applied to Pharaoh, and it applied to the children of Israel as well, who very often won't listen. And from the beginning of the story, Moshe has complained to God, who always listens to him, that the people will not listen to me. See, the people won't listen to me. People haven't listened to me. How do you expect Pharaoh to listen to me here? So there's a lot of talk about not listening. The people will not believe me, and they will not listen to me, over and over again. And it proves to be true. It proves to be true even in the words. The words actually say it, but people don't listen to him. And then later, simply in the narratives of rebellion, over and over again, the people are ostentatiously not listening. On some level, they have blocked themselves off. And when Moshe complains to God in the past, God doesn't exactly resolve the issue. He doesn't exactly make him feel better. He simply, it's like perhaps like a good therapist. He just makes a little humming noise, as if to say, yes, well, let's see. Let's see what happens. When it comes to making the people listen to him, it seems to me that that is the reason that he says about himself at the burning bush. In 3 different ways, he says, I'm not a person who knows how to speak. I don't know how to speak. First, he says it very plainly, Lo ish devarim anochi, I am not a man of words. And then, in case the point didn't come across, he says, Ani kvad peh ukvad lashon, I'm heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. And that means he's describing what we call an impediment, a weight, heavy. A heaviness in my mouth. It's a physical description of what it's like not to be able to speak. Whether that's a physical impediment or simply a metaphor for the that you have sometimes, that speaking is heavy, that communication is not working, that I can't make them listen to me. And it seems to me that when Moshe protests in this way about his organic problem, in speaking, he is really very eloquently, actually. I like to say that he's never as eloquent as when he is describing how he can't speak. That's when he really blooms. Metaphors, what's the third thing he says there? He says, I am of uncircumcised lips. What a grotesque image, right? The lips are meant to, you've seen what people do when they're talking. If you look in the mirror, or if I look in it's a little bit embarrassing, because what lips do is kind of flap away. The lips are just flapping away. It's a purely physical flap that's going on there. And for some reason, Moshe feels he has sealed lips. He has lips that are somehow webbed together. Aral, there's an orla. There's a foreskin on his lips. There's a vivid image for the feeling I can't get through. I can't make them listen to me. That's as far as the people were concerned. And Moshe was vindicated in this feeling. The people didn't listen to him. But he complains to God about it, while with God, as we said before, he always has a good person to talk to. That is, his real conversation partner is with God. He goes up to the top of the mountain. There is revelation at the top of the mountain. God reveals things to him. God speaks to him. And the sense is that Moshe is never so happy as there at the top of the mountain talking to God. That's where his life of listening and hearing comes to its perfect poise. And so much so that God has to more or less drive him down the mountain. Remember, twice during the Ten Commandments and during the Golden Calf episodes, God says to Moshe, Lech red, get on down there. In other words, rather forceful words that say, detach yourself from this blissful communication with the divine and get on down there to the people who you have difficulty in communicating with. That's where your job is to be done, not up here having sublime experience here. It's almost the midrashic elaboration of that expression, get on down there, lech red, is almost cruel. Again, very harsh. It picks up what we've seen in God's final refusal. Midrash says this, Rashi quotes it, Ata lamali. Ata lamali. Shocking. You, what do I need? Why do I need you? I don't need you. I only need you for the sake of the people. You, your whole existence and your whole, the pleasure of our intimacy is there for the sake of the family. It's there for the sake of those people there that you have no common language with. And so get on down there. It's all Bishvil Yisrael. Now that's, again, a rather harsh thing for Moshe to be told. And that's at the height of the story and in the depth of the story, in the moment of revelation and in the moment of idolatry. in the moment of the great failure of the people in making the golden calf, that's when God sends him down there to deal with it, to go down there and see how he can communicate with the people. And so what we have here, and I want to come back then to the speech of refusal that we have here, we have God being furious with me for your sake, and he wouldn't listen to me. For the first time, God was not listening to me. And God said to me, Ravlach. Now finally God does say something. He says, that's quite enough. Ravlach. Al tosef daber elai od badavar hazeh. Even the sound of the words, you can hear it, the bits and the reshes. Don't go on talking to me anymore about this matter. No more talking. This is the God to whom Moshe could always speak. And God says, stop right there. Ravlacha. That's more than enough. No more talking to me about this matter. Now, what we can pick up from this is, the most obvious level, is God is saying, don't stop talking to me altogether, but on this matter, we have nothing to talk about. In other words, it's a way of saying no, without actually saying the words no. And the no only follows in the following verse. Go up to the top of this mountain, lift up your eyes, west, north, south, and east, and look with your eyes. Ki lo ta'avor et hayarden hazeh. Because you will not, there's the negative, you will not cross over this Jordan. So Moshe had asked Brana, please let me cross over. And God now finally, at the end of a stage-by-stage anguish in the story that Moshe is telling the people here, first God wouldn't listen to me, and then God was angry with me, and then God interrupted me and stopped me talking, and then finally he said to me, no. So the no is almost, it's not the climax in a way. It's a sense of disturbed relations with God. And God now is saying, I don't want to hear another word, at least on this matter. The strange thing is, and I want to bring this up now as a strange thing, that if we think, when was this prayer? It's one of the questions that arises in the commentaries, that Moshe talks to the people and tells them the story of this rude rejection, this harsh rejection. So the first question I have about that is, why tell the people such a sad story? In fact, a story about madness. I don't know how to put it. It's a story about the world out of joint. Suddenly, everything that Moshe expects of the world has let him down. It's not only that he always expected to lead the people into Eretz Canaan from the beginning, from the burning bush. That was the agenda. That was the program. But more than that, that God has stopped him talking, that God has interrupted him in this delicate area of communication in which there is one happy phase. And that issue then, and then of course the refusal. So why did he tell that story of humiliation and frustration? You know, you can think of examples in your life. You know, your boss talks to you in a very rude and rejecting way. Would you make this a subject of an inspiring speech to your people? In other words, why would you tell about a private embarrassment, put it very mildly, when you're trying in some way to encourage your people in the last months of your life? Right? These are actually the last 5 weeks of Moshe's life. It begins with, at the book of Deuteronomy, Ele hadvarim, these are the words that Moshe spoke to the whole of Israel. That's how the book begins. And it's dated. When does it begin? And it's 5 weeks before Rosh Chodesh. I'm sorry, my mind's not working today. It's 5 weeks before the imputed date of his death, which is Zayin Adar, the 7th day of Adar. So it's Rosh Chodesh of the new moon of the month before. So in these speeches, he speaks to all Israel throughout this book. Right? It makes this book very much his speeches. A good part of the book is made up of his speeches, his history, his way of reminding the people about their past and urging them and exhorting them for the future. Why, in this precious book, in which we have for the first time a kind of personal note in the sense of the shared history of Moshe and the people, why suddenly tell them this story? What good is that going to do them? To tell them, I prayed to God with all my heart and he refused me. And he refused me harshly. What lesson can you learn from that? What orderly religious lesson? You know, the kind of lessons that people, I think, often seem to feel. I always feel a little disturbed by this, that people talk about teachings, that there should be teachings from everything. We should have learnings. We should have lessons. And sometimes these lessons that we seem to expect strike me as, slightly childish. That is, why do you always expect to get a kind of, a rah-rah, happy ending speech? Yeah, that lessons could be really much less encouraging and much more difficult to hear than simply, oh, you'll see, all will be well. Surely there has to be some reason why Moshe takes this moment of rupture and stands at this moment of rupture between himself and God and tells it to the people. What do they possibly learn from this? So deep is our expectation of a good and happy and apparent meaning to the whole event that the Midrash will actually say, this teaches you that even if a sharp sword is hanging over a person's neck, he shouldn't withhold himself from hoping for mercy. In other words, he shouldn't give up. Even if you're on the very verge of the end, don't give up. And there are examples of this, of someone who at the very end was saved. But how does that apply to this situation? It simply doesn't apply, right? It fails to meet this situation because God doesn't change his mind here, right? He changed his mind when Moshe pleaded with him for the people, if you remember in the past. But for himself, God didn't change his mind, and therefore what's the point of telling the people about a rejected prayer, which is more than just a rejected prayer? As I say, I think it's a sense of the world falling apart, that he doesn't know anymore where to put himself in the world. When did he make this prayer? Well, we'd never have heard about this prayer if we hadn't heard it from this story. It's the story that he tells the people that tells them and tells us that he did pray and that God rejected it. There is no objective, neutral account of it in the Torah. So if Moshe hadn't told the story, it would have remained a private interrelationship, a moment between himself and God. So why tell it? And secondly, when did he tell it? When did he pray? Since it's not told in the Torah, it's kind of intriguing to wonder, so when did he feel a sudden upburst of hope and decide, after all, to beg God? He wouldn't stay quiet, he would actually ask God. And there are a couple of suggestions. One is, it was at the moment of the battles in Transjordan, when the people were approaching the river and they were being victorious. And Moshe now begins to think that since he's been allowed to come so close to the river, spatially and geographically, maybe there is a reprieve to be had from God, that God has allowed him perhaps, and all it would take perhaps would be a prayer from him to shift the divine will. That's a kind of hope, but God dashes the hope. There are one or two other suggestions. And one is that it's after the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad. At the end of the book of Numbers, chapter 27, God, in a way, changes the law, changes the decree about the inheritance of daughters under certain circumstances. It's a kind of, quote, feminist moment. I don't think it's really very feminist. The gains are very small. But where there are no sons, daughters can inherit. And after that, that's where Rashi wants to what's the word I want? He wants to put in there, insert. He wants to insert the unheard prayer. Right? The prayer, he wants to say that was the moment that Moshe thought, this is my moment. God is in that kind of state. He's in a state of rachamim, in a state of compassion. Perhaps there will be a releasing of my decree as well. Things will be softened and will be opened up. But it doesn't happen. And what happens when God, at that point, also says, climb the mountain and look, because you're not going to get further than that? We read after that, Vayidaber Moshe el Hashem. And Moshe then spoke forcibly to God, and said to him, in that case, please make sure we have a good leader to take my place. Now, what's astonishing about this is the word Vayidaber. How often do you think is Moshe medaber to God? There are plenty of times he is Vayomer, and he said to God. That's routine. He actually never speaks to God, because speaking, daber, dibur, right? This is midrashic tradition, has about it something forceful, even harsh. It has something of the leader about it, the leader of leadership, dabar. That speaking, in a way, is directing the other person. So presumably that word wouldn't be used to describe your tone if you're talking to God. Moshe doesn't talk to God in that tone, except on this one occasion, when he's just had his hopes dashed. And that occasion, paradoxically, suddenly he finds it in himself to use muscles that he didn't know he had, yes, in his speaking to God, to speak forcibly to God, not in a feminine tone. There are these strange midrashim about Moshe occasionally in the course of his story feeling weak, feeling himself sagging in the presence of the power of God, of not being able to control the issues. And he's weakened. And at this point, what does the midrash say? And Rashi quotes in his way. He says, a person who, on leaving the world, no longer pays attention, is no longer concerned with his own affairs, but gets involved in the affairs of society and the affairs of the people that he is leaving behind. Ki'ilu ba bizroa. Wonderful expression. It's as if he came with a strong arm. That is, suddenly Moshe feels a flood of strength and vigor. Dafka, if you know what I mean, precisely at the moment when he has been thrown into despair. He's been told, no exit. You can't do that. You can't, don't even talk to me about it. And so here I want to suggest, if you look back at that original rejection by God, that there's one word in what God says that gives us a hint here. It's not just that God says, don't speak to me anymore about this thing, but he says, don't speak to me about this thing. Medaber elai. Now you can make nothing of that. It's just necessary to say it like that. Or you can say that God is somewhere hinting. There's a little emphasis there. Stop talking to me. It's like lechred. If you want to talk about this great disappointment, this great rejection that has now made you dizzy in a way, you don't know where to turn, you don't know what to do at this moment, then go to the people. Go tell the people, right? They are not God, anything but, yes. But you need to talk to the people and talk to them about this. That's the strange thing. Talk to them about this failure. Now, this is quite mysterious at the moment, because what it's saying is that the world has come to an end. Harav alav olamo, that Moshe's world has fallen apart, and he's to go and tell a story about it to the people. Why? What does he hope to gain from people? That's the question. What he wanted was to go across the river. He wanted to go across. And when God says to him, no, lo ta'avor, it follows immediately afterwards. So charge Yoshua and make him strong and of good courage. Ki hu ya'avor lifnei Hashem, because he will go across in the presence of God. In other words, going across is not just crossing the river. It becomes almost an independent movement to go across. All right, there's a river there. We all know that that's the marker, that you want to get beyond the river into the Holy Land. But going across begins to acquire a kind of ethical force of its own. The idea of you will not be going across, and he will be going across. A little later, Moshe says, it's not very long later, Moshe says to the people, it's chapter 4, verse 22, he says, Ki anochi met, for I am dying in this land. Eineni overet hayarden. I'm not crossing the Jordan. Now, if one is dying, presumably one's not crossing the Jordan. So why make a point of saying it? I am dying, but that's not the end. That's not the real gist of the story. The story is I'm not crossing the Jordan, but atem over him, and you will cross. And there is the contrast set up. I'm not crossing, you are. And this will occur sporadically throughout the book of Diaries. Throughout this book of the many words of Moshe to the people. That's what characterizes this book. For the first time, he is speaking forcefully from his own being to the people. It's a personal conversation, such as he's never had before. Before, he was always God's messenger. He was conveying, transmitting the words of God, the laws particularly, yes, and rebukes and so forth. Now there's a personal note because it includes this book of words, of many words, spoken by someone who could not speak. Yes. If you look at the last source on your page, I just want to quote the beginning of it. An ironic note is struck here about the new world of Moshe, how Moshe is now experiencing a new world. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel, the beginning of the book. Israel said, Etmol amarta lo ish devarim anochi. Just yesterday you said, I'm not a man of words. And now you have so much to talk about. In other words, there's a kind of ironic comment by Israel. Look at you. This is a new you. Moshe ra'a olam chadash. He is seeing, in a certain sense, which we have yet to feel. Moshe is feeling himself as speaking as he never could before, and as organically he was not made to do. Right? In some way, he was always right. I'm not someone who can do that. No? It's a given, almost. And now it seems as if God has pushed him down the mountain by saying, stop talking to me. And it's very harsh. You can't, it's an ending. We can't rush right away into saying, oh yes, but there was a new beginning. That's not at all so. It's an ending. And then there is, for some reason, this story. What is being achieved in this story? What does he want to do by telling them a story of failure and rupture? I would say almost, I'm using rather strong expressions, but I think that's the way one feels sometimes. It's almost a sense of the grotesque. There's something grotesque about this. Here I am without my whole purpose, with a God who seems to have alienated himself after a very good relationship, after a history of a very close relationship. And here I am now talking to the people and saying to them throughout Sefer Devarim things like obvious things, like you are crossing over, for instance. He says that to them sometimes without adding, I am not crossing over. Sometimes he does say, I am not crossing over. In other words, whether he says it or not, what he's really saying to the people is, I am not crossing over. What does he want to achieve? Right? There's a desire there of some kind. There's a desire not to cross over. He knows that's gone. It's a desire that gets mediated now through words to the people, through a tale, to a story that he tells to the people, and through this expression, I'm not crossing over, that he keeps on assailing the people with. He keeps on, hammering it in. You know you're crossing over. I'm not crossing over. So now let's have a look on the way to this amazing midrashic material. If you look at number 4, yes, number 4 on your page, you can see a hassidic passage by the Shiloach, great 19th century commentary on the Torah. He was a Hassidic master and commentary on the Torah. And he tends to have radical and provocative things to say. And we're talking here now about a radical situation. From the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, Moshe said to the people, right at the beginning there, chapter 1, verse 9, "Va'omar lachem be'etahi." And I said to you at that time, again, we don't know what time, but Moshe is reminding the people of a previous speech that he had made to them. And he said, "Lo uchal levadi set etchem." What did I say to you at that time? I said, I can no longer carry you alone. I can no longer bear you by myself, take responsibility for you on my own. Therefore, what you should do is to appoint a hierarchy of support leaders to back me up. Chachamim, people who are chachamim, nevonim, v'yeduim. People who are wise, intelligent, understanding, nevonim, but we're going to explore that word, navon, bina. And the third thing is, let's say, well-known, distinguished people, people who have a good reputation. And they will help me in governing you, because you're just too much for me. That's the obvious meaning of that text, that Moshe is complaining to the people, and he's saying, you are just too big a handful for me. You keep on causing me so much trouble. I can't control you. So I'm exhausted. Please. So it reminds us of the story of Yitro, appointing all the whole small claims courts, yes? And that's the obvious meaning. But our Hasidic master starts to tell us what I'd almost call a postmodern story. A very different story, not a story you expected. And he says this: when the people were close to entering the land, Moshe felt that it was the wish of God that it was through Joshua that they would enter the land. In other words, that he would be the leader. But Moshe wished, there's that word again, Moshe knows it's God's wish or will that Joshua will lead them. But Moshe also has a wish, and he wishes that Israel will pray for him, that they don't wish for any other leader but him. So listen to all the wishes, listen to all the desires here that are filling the air. There is God's wish, there's God's desire that Joshua will be the leader and Moshe will step off stage. But Moshe has a wish. And what is his wish? Not to cross over. That's not the way it's put. He knows that he can't achieve that directly. That the people should so much wish for him to continue as leader that they will pray for him. And he hinted that to them. How did he hint it? By saying, I can't carry you alone. The obvious meaning of that, we said, was, I can't go on leading you without some help. The other possible meaning is, I can't continue leading you without your help. The way things are now, I will not continue to be your leader. Yes, my story will end on this side of the river. If you really want me to continue being your leader, then please pray for me. That's the hidden meaning that the Shiloach hears in the words. What's the point of this? What has he got to gain from this? Well, one thing he gains is by intimating that there is a form of communication in which Moshe can't clearly tell the people what he wants. He can't say to the people, right? It's not a matter of clear speech here. He can't say to the people, I need you to pray for me. As we could if we were asking a friend, yes? He can't, because what he's really saying is, I want you to want me. I want you to want me so much that you will pray for me. In other words, it's something that can't be forced. You either want me or you don't. So if I tell you, please want me, then in a way I have undercut myself. If you desire someone and you say to them, I want you to desire me, that could be not helpful. What can I say? That could be unhelpful. People don't like to be told what they should want. Right? They don't even like to be asked to want. And he's talking here not about prayer as a formality. He's talking about desire. Do you desire me? Do you really love me? And these are not words that he can use overtly. He can't say that. In other words, there is a kind of communication that consists in not speaking clearly and in hoping for one thing. There was one thing that he hoped for, and that's called bina, sheyavinu, that they should understand. What is understanding? Understanding in the classic understanding of the word is to understand one thing from the midst of another. Lahavin davar mitoch davar. To say something that has in it margins of meaning, implicit meaning. And someone can hear those hints. Someone can hear what you're not saying. That's bina. Women are notoriously adept, apparently, according to the rabbis. Women are very good at this kind of thing. So we could call it intuition. A certain sense of intuition, not just to listen to the words as if that's the end of the story, the dictionary meaning of every word, but to hear, to look at the body language, to hear the implications of the words. And he's hoping that something of his desire will come across to the people and touch off their desire. And what happens? In a word, lo hevinu. They did not get it. That's the way he tells the story, which is a very untypical way, again, of talking about a teaching in the Torah. Because we assume if there's a teaching of some kind, then it will be described on its hopeful side. It will be described, no, this is what you should be doing. Here instead, you have a kind of vague intimation that Moshe is the only way he can express himself. And he's hoping against hope that the people will have that extra something that allows that sharp ear, that allows them to intuit, to imagine, right? Emotional intelligence, we call it sometimes. And that's why, in terms of this Hasidic tale that we have here, that's why when we read afterwards that when Moshe's command that they should appoint a whole series of wise, intelligent, and distinguished people, when that was fulfilled, right? That's a pshat. That's the obvious meaning. That was fulfilled. But what we read is that there were chachamim and yeduim, just two descriptions, not three. What happened to the third description? Nevonim. And there, the midrash already, way back, 2,000 years ago, says Moshe says. We couldn't, but people say we couldn't find any nevonim. Nevonim lo matzati. Right, in all these people, we couldn't find any intuitive people. Now, on the common sense level, that midrash addresses the common sense level, which is simply, that the people have a dearth, there's a scarcity. It's a terrible canard against the Jewish people. That they may be very intelligent, and they may be very distinguished in a lot of things, but they're not so good at getting the hint. And they don't pick up on things that are not said, at least in that generation, let's say, to save their face. But of course, what our Hasidic writer wants to say is on the personal level. It's not just on the obvious public level. There were no Nevonim around. There was no one who could understand what I was really saying. Now, how much can people be blamed for not getting it? Is that a criminal offense, not to get it? Is there a punishment for that? Obviously not. You can't expect it of the other person, and yet emotionally we do expect it. Certainly in certain relationships. And so here you have a non-legal situation. It's not a matter of a sin. It's not a matter of, it's something very delicate that didn't happen. Something might have happened that might have helped. That's the way he puts it. It might have helped. And it had to do with a desire for desire. Moshe's desire for the people's desire, which in modern psychoanalysis is seen, Jacques Lacan, French psychoanalyst, talks about that as a very important focus of desire, that what we desire very often is the desire of the other. But then the question is, how do you go about getting it? It can only be done through seduction of one kind or another in the largest sense. And that's what Moshe tries here. And when I read this, it struck me as so modern. It's not postmodern, as I say, because it's so not hard-edged. It's not empirical. I was quite in wonder at it. And it occurred to me to look to see if he had any predecessors. In other words, is there anything in the classic sources that in any way can be seen as the source of this reading? It didn't seem likely, but I had the immense pleasure. It's one of those extraordinary pleasures that you have if you can't use the high tech, the technology of looking things up on those the sophisticated platforms and getting a quick answer just by reading through the midrash. So the old-fashioned way, I came across 2 such passages. In other words, this idea goes right back to the beginning of time. It goes right back to the time of the rabbis. Yeah. Somewhere a kind of subversive way of reading. Why is Moshe addressing the people with his own painful story? Because in some way, his desire is now operating on the people's desire. In some way, he's trying to get the people to sense the pathos of his need for them at this moment without overwhelming them, without really asking for it, because that would be the end of leadership. He has to remain leader and yet in some way elicit some desire from the people. And it doesn't work. That's the bottom line. It doesn't work. So it's a strategy that falls flat. So why do we need to hear about it? Again, I might say, so something that doesn't work, why tell us at such great length? Let's have a look at number 5. Number 5, when they came to cross the Jordan, Moses reminded them, Moshe reminded them, how often he had pleaded as a defense counsel for them when they were in trouble, the golden calf, for instance, and he had achieved success. He had saved them from much worse than happened to them. Shehaya savur shehem mevakshim alav rachamim. What a sentence. He pleaded for them because he was sure. Savur. Savur means really some asvara, means a plausible assumption. He thought it was perfectly reasonable to expect that they, if he ever needed them, that they would do the same for him. Now, I want to pause at that for a moment. Of course, one can read this, I think, in a very unhelpful way and say that Moshe was expecting tit for tat, let's say, right? I'm putting it really crudely. I helped you so often, I expected you to help me. And you were amazingly unhelpful when it came to it. I prefer to read it like this, and I think it actually meets the feeling that the relationship that Moshe sensed between him and the people, the sense of some kind of strange unity, even though they are so different, he has such trouble talking to them, right? That there nevertheless is some kind of basic commonality there. And that they would feel the passion of his interventions. And of course they would, it's just the nature of the relationship. That if he were in trouble, then of course he would, no question about it. And then what happens? He says to them, and this is his way of hinting to them, it's not just that he tells the story of how God rejected him, we'll come closer to that, but it's that he keeps on saying to them, you're crossing over. It's as simple as that. You're crossing over is the hint. And he says it an unnecessary number of times because he is constantly trying to wake them up, some sense. So there's some, why does he keep on hammering on that theme? We know already. And it doesn't work. What is this like? Like a king who he married an aristocratic lady, and she displeased him in some way. I'm going to say this with a straight face. She displeased him, and he said he's going to divorce her. He decided to divorce her and take another wife. So he calls her and he says to her, "Have you heard that I'm taking another wife?" And she says, "Yes. Can I know the lady's name?" And the king tells her the next queen's name. And the lady doesn't answer her husband. But she goes and gathers her children together, their children together, children of her husband and herself. And she says to them, "Have you heard that your father is taking another wife? Can you put up with having a stepmother?" Something like that. Yes. Do you realize what a stepmother is, according to all the fairy tales and legends, not according to reality, of course? And they say, "Yes." In other words, "Yeah, that's fine. Yeah." No, nothing bothers them. And then she tries to spell out a little bit how bad it will be for them to have someone, right, who can't really act as a buffer between the harsh father and the troublesome children. That is your troubled relationship with God. Yeah, your troubled relationship with your father. Fathers and sons have a lot of trouble in the midrash. Right, it's understood that there are strong passions at work between fathers and sons. At least you had, right, with an Oedipal situation, there were 3 sides to the situation, not just 2. You had a mother who was also his wife. So that allowed a certain softening, that allowed access, a special kind. Can you put up with not having that situation? And they say blithely, "Yes." At which point she says, "Now I tell you the truth, I'm worried about you. Not about me anymore. Up to now, I was pleading for myself. I was hoping you would react to intervene for me. But now I'm worried about you. How are you going to handle the situation with your father without my help? Because I see that on some level you are, I don't know what kind word to use, so it's not too damning, right? You're insensitive, you're unimaginative, something like that you have no idea. In some sense, you have no clue. How can you just be so blithely unaware of the implications of losing your mother? That right? Perhaps they think, in the most blithe way possible. They think, well, maybe a new young mother would be quite interesting, just to have someone else to brighten up the day. Who knows what they think? And that strange callousness, which I don't want to overstate it, but it says, can't you hear? Can't you hear what I'm saying to you? There's a burden to what I'm saying. And that inability to hear, the mother now takes very seriously. And she says, you better fear the Lord your God. Et Hashem Elokecha tirah. You'd better, smarten up in your relation to God, because things will no longer be so relaxed as I've made them be while I was still around. And what you have here then is, again, this theme of it. The hope that they would listen and they would understand and that they would ask for mercy. And it doesn't happen. Be careful for yourselves. The next midrash, number 6, I'm just going to touch on it very briefly, begins by quoting another verse of hinting. And this is very powerful. This one really says it all but. And it comes up at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy. Right? So we began at the beginning with the hint there, I can't carry you alone. Then there was the story of rejection. Then there are various references to your crossing over. And the last thing we have, and the most powerful, I think, is it's one of the last speeches that Moshe makes to the people. He says to them, V'lo natan lachem lev ladat ve'einayim lirot ve'oznayim lishmoa ad hayom hazeh. And God has not given you a heart to know, a knowing heart. Listen to that. A feeling, knowing heart. And eyes to see and ears to hear until this day. until this day. And this is almost his farewell speech to the people. And it clearly proclaims a certain sense that Moshe has that the people are insensible. Right? There's something insensate about them. They don't have good ears and good eyes. They're not functioning as they should be. And of course, the heart of it is the heart. That is the heart mind. Lev ladat. It's not entirely emotional, and it's not entirely intellectual. It has to do with what we call emotional intelligence. Yes, it has to do with a certain alertness and awareness and antennae of one kind or another. And here Moshe is saying in no uncertain terms about, again, on the face of it, he's saying it to them about their relationship with God, public things to do with their status as in history. That up to now, you have proved to be very unresponsive to the redemptive history that you have lived through, that you have no gratitude. That's the word that Rashi uses to translate their lack. You have no hakarat. You don't know how to acknowledge goodness. You don't know how to acknowledge. And so on the surface, the obvious meaning is that he is charging them with ingratitude throughout their history. Ingratitude to God, that is. That's the public meaning. But again, the Midrash will come and say, rather daringly, I think, he was saying that Moshe also has a personal level in his address to the people. He's saying to them, you were amazingly insensate. You were amazingly unaware of what the situation called for in terms of your intervening for me in some way. In other words, desire didn't seem to be thick on the ground. You didn't seem to have much need for me when it came to it. As we have a quick look at the Midrash, you can see that at this point, he is talking bishvil atzmo, right at the beginning there. That verse, which we take as a public verse, a verse about the people's religious status vis-a-vis God, is actually about himself and the people. And that, I think, is quite unexpected, in a way, to reduce a religious description of the people to you and me. Now, why? It's personal, can almost sound petty. Why is he putting that reckoning into the, my merely personal feelings about you? And yet, for some reason, Moshe seems to understand that being personal is just the way to go. That's what will distinguish this new world from his previous world. One world has gone, and now in some way he has to reach across he can't go across the river, and he has to find a way of reaching across the barrier from his people, which is a real gap. It's not an imagined thing, to reach across. And so, for instance, the story is told here, and I'll just gesture at it. What happened was that Moshe intervened for the people, and God said he was about to destroy the people of the golden calf. Moshe then said, Slach la, please forgive the people, and God responded to fulfill Moshe's wish. Salachti kidvarecha. Here we are coming up to Yom Kippur. Salachti, I have forgiven as you have spoken. In other words, I allowed your words to overcome my intention, my gzera, my decree. And then Moshe said something for himself. He thought it was quite legitimate. He wanted to ask for something for himself. And God said, you will not cross over. And Moshe said, let me cross over. And God then says to Moshe, you can't have it both ways. It's a very strange answer. You're holding the rope by both ends. You can't have it both in relation to the first decree and in relation to the second decree, the public one for the people and the personal one for yourself. You can't master. You can't be a master of both situations. You can't deceive reality in a way. To say that you are in charge, that your wishes and desires always get their way. When it comes, it's one or the other. In other words, you have to make a choice. It's a necessary choice. Why is it necessary? I've struggled with this. Why can't you have both? You know, in a way, I would ask. Yeah, something in me. It's a matter somewhere here of recognizing the world as a world out of joint. And that's the sober message, teaching, that I think Moshe is dealing with here. That the world has fallen apart, right? In some way, the world doesn't always hang together. As long as it seems to hang together well, through repetition and time and so forth, we get to think this is the way it must be. It seems to make sense. But actually, the world can't be counted on to make sense. And so, on some level, there is something in the nature of the world that means that there is a bittersweetness. Now, using that expression, there's a bittersweetness about desire. Bittersweet is the description by the Greek poet Sappho of Eros. Eros, the bittersweet. And she describes she is a great poetess of Greek, the Greek lyric. When she, in her love poems, when she describes desire, Eros, she calls it the bittersweet. Sweet because it means somewhere unifying two who are different, reaching out to the other and making him one with yourself, him, her, one with yourself, and the bitterness because you fail to make the connection. That there is a partial failure, that there is a limitation, that there is something usually that doesn't quite. Right? And that's the very nature of desire. It's the very nature, therefore, of Moshe's life, which is a life of desire. And that's the next point that I would like to try to fill out here somewhat briefly. When Moshe says, Brana, please let me cross over, he is saying something about crossing over. What is crossing over? It's not just fording the river. You know, you get into a boat or let the river split or to get across a physical obstacle. La'avor, ever, has the meaning of the reach of desire, of moving away from where you are, beyond the edges, the ever of yourself, to stand at the very limits of yourself and reach across to something else, to something that is strange and other and it's not the same as you. And that desire is sweet and it's also bitter. But there is something, always there is a kind of disjointedness. Right? Always, often, I don't know what to say. My optimism still leads me to say often rather than always. I do believe that there are certain instances in which one gets perhaps more than one desire. You know, that one didn't quite know how much one desired something until it came true. But that's not always what one chooses to desire. The things that one chooses to desire sometimes, and it's of the very nature of desire. So there is a wonderful book by Anne Carson, who is a Canadian poet and translator from the Greek and director of plays and you name it, essayist, multi-talented woman writer. And the book is called Eros, the Bittersweet. And there she talks about this reaching out. And she says, reaching out, and she quotes Aristotle, for instance, all human beings by their very nature reach out to know. In other words, one reaches out in two areas. The erotic reach is the reach of love, desire, and it's the reach of knowledge. That is, you reach out in order to know something that is beyond your ignorance. At the moment, you don't know. And you stand at the very edge of your existence as a person, as a person with a certain meaning and identity, right? Almost an unstable place. And if you have the courage to desire and you reach out for that which will, in a way, it may destroy everything I know up to now. I'm taking a risk. Or it may complete it. Right? It may turn out to be harmonious, and it may not turn out to be harmonious. Now that's in a very rudimentary way. That, what is the word love for? Ever, avar, the past. That something is in the past. the Oxford English Dictionary defines the word past, in case you need a definition, as gone, lapsed, done with, over. That is, la'avor is to leave behind. In terms of time, is to leave the present behind, right? And, or to leave what was the present behind and move onwards. In terms of space, dodi chamak avar. I'm starting almost at random with a few examples. Song of Songs is full of that reach, the erotic reach, which doesn't quite make it. In the course of the book, there is no union. There is no. It's all. What do we read? My beloved. Remember, she goes to the door because her lover knocks. I think it's chapter 4 in the Song of Songs, and then we read, my beloved chamak slipped past, the avar passed on. In other words, he was elusive. You know, by the time I got to the door, he'd gone. He was leading me on a merry chase. But that is the nature of the book. It's not such a merry chase. Because Steve, I sought him, I desired him, velo matzati, and I didn't find him. Right? Which is almost implicit. Right? You can take it as a paradox, but it's not a paradox. It's actually, if you seek, then you will not find. You know, it's the seeking in some way that will have to be sweet. Right? Somewhere is an imaginative sense of what one is looking for. Human life compared to a sail over, a passing shadow. Yeah? It's not enough that it's a shadow and insubstantial, but it slips past. And it's here for a moment, and then it's not here. Right? You reach out on a hot day. I think this actually comes from Greek lyric poetry, this image. You reach out on a hot day for ice, and you grasp the ice, and it melts in your hand. In a sense, the absence of what you want is the meaning of what you want. As long as you're in some way holding two incongruous themes together, you are the hero of desire. You are someone that is, you know on the one hand what you want, and you know on the other hand that you can't concretely, fulfill that desire. Now, that, according to Kafka, is essential Moshe. And I'll read you this very poignant passage from Kafka's Diaries. This is what Kafka says. He is on the track of Canaan all his life. It is incredible that he should see the land only when on the verge of death. The dying vision of it, right? There was a strong visual element. He would see, but not cross over. The dying vision of it can only be intended to illustrate how incomplete a moment is human life. Incomplete because a life like this could last forever and still be nothing but a moment. The fact that it would last forever doesn't mean that we would have time to fulfill the desire. And then this last sentence, Moses fails to enter Canaan, not because his life is too short, but because it is a human life. It's not that his life was cut off short. That's one way of talking about the world coming to an end. That one's actual physical lifespan came to an abrupt end, Lorraine. But that's not the interesting thing. The meaning is, even if he had lived another 120 years, it would still be a human life. And as such, incomplete. Yes, that's why I called my book on Moses. I mentioned that, Moses, a human life. And I was really referring directly to this quote. So what do we have with Moses? Moses has a moment of transience, transitions, things passing by so that he can't really grasp them at the top of the mountain. Yes? When Moses says, Moshe says, please let me see your face. Let me see your glory. And God says, no human being, no human can see me and live. This is what I will do. Right? When I will make pass by. I will make all my goodness, all my virtue, all my radiance, right, pass by your face. Now that's an ominous word, pass by, so that you'll reach out for it. And then what will happen is I'll put you into a crevice in the rock, and I will cover the crevice with my hand. And as I pass by, right, as I pass by, I will remove my hand, so you'll get a glimpse, but no more, because I will immediately disappear through the crack. You won't be able to see anymore. And then you will see my back and not my front. Not my face, but et achurai. And whatever the back means, right, here it means perhaps a partial glimpse. You'll be able to look, you'll see the trace of my having been here in some sense. You will see my pastness. You will feel the fact, you will feel the trace of my having been there. That is what you will be granted. My face would be total presence. It would be something static, as it were, something that you can hold unequivocally. And that's not for human life. That's not. Right? There are mystics who have desired this, and perhaps to some extent have achieved it, but not Moshe. Moshe speaks to God face to face. In speaking, there's the pathos. In speaking, he is in some way in real relationship with God, but not visually. That's the mystic's desire, that visual, intimate sense. And that has to do, again, with the passage. This is swift transience of the way that we register things in human life. What we could say, if we were, how does Moshe feel when he sees only God's back? Perhaps he could feel totally disappointed. When God knew what I wanted. I wanted something else. Or he could begin to learn something from his own experience. He could begin to grow somewhere from a certain kind of total desire to a desire that has to do with communicating with the people. The horizon of desire will no longer be seeing God's face or seeing the Holy Land up front, face to face. It will be communicating with the people. If I can break through, if I can reach out to them, then that will serve a very important purpose, especially if my sense is, Moshe's sense is, that the people are direly lacking an essential faculty, that they don't have a lev ladat, that there's a certain kind of callousness, and I don't even want to emphasize so much the ethical side of it, although that's certainly there too, causes great pain, such insensitivity causes great pain, but it even has to do with their capacity for continuing to serve God. How can they be religious people? How can they work with their text? How can they work with Torah if they don't know how to read the Torah with bina, with a sense of, like I'd almost say like a midrashic sense of things, of what is not said, with a sense of how to fill in the gaps, a sense of courage and imagination. There's no other way of putting it. And Moshe now wants in some way to elicit from them a profound experience of just that. An experience of, how can I put it, an experience of their own ignorance, of their own unawareness behind. And so he is mochiach them. That's the word that the midrash uses. So he rebukes them. What kind of a rebuke is the story? The story of his rejection by God, the story of his constant hints to the people, right? All that. He makes that into a story. And the story is a rebuke. The story is an implicit rebuke. Again, they don't need to get it if they don't want to. But somewhere they begin to get a sense of their own blind spot, if I can put it like that. He doesn't necessarily say it in so many words. He's still hinting. He says things in the second midrash, like when he had to choose between himself, the good of himself, and the good of the people. He said, let Moses and 100 like him die, but not one fingernail on their hands be injured. In other words, it's an over-the-top opting for the welfare of the people. Such is Moshe's passion for the people. He's ready to die a thousand deaths. Whereas you, somewhere that is spelling it out pretty clearly. The way he says it is one person could save 600,000 people from death, and 600,000 people couldn't save one person. They didn't want to, didn't feel the need for it, couldn't mobilize themselves. Now that is, you might say, a rather broad hint. I don't know. It's a hint, since he's not hinting really for himself now, but for them. He wants to make them aware of what they lack some way. And the way he does it, with this we have to come close to finishing, the way he does it, I would suggest, is this, that he tells them a story of painful humiliation, of frustration, which is really fed not only by God's rejection, but by their insensitivity, their insensibility. That's overall the story he tells. What is he doing? Is he just complaining? Right? Isn't that a rather undignified position for Moshe? Instead of being the authoritative transmitter of laws, he's suddenly become, well, you can fill in the Yiddish word there. Yes, he's suddenly become a complainer. Is that what he's doing? And what I'm suggesting is that Moshe is staging for them. He's staging for them his own process of coming to knowledge. That is, it's a process in which what comes out rather clearly, hopefully, is his own sense of grief, of disappointment, of disillusionment, yes, even of bitterness with the people, of resentment. One can hear all that in these midrashim, which could be a very undignified posture for him. But the fact is that on some level, what he is doing is just talking to them. He is talking to them from the heart. And what comes out almost unconsciously from the depths of his being, are these layers of not very lovable traits, you might say, in himself. Very human traits. You know, this is what happens. And there is a sense then that the people are learning from his movement or his desire somewhere to move towards knowledge, to move towards, he's reaching out for a way of being better than that, for a way of moving from that to some meeting with the people. And the people hear him, and there's a very, Shoshana Feldman, who is a contemporary literary critic and psychoanalyst, has a wonderful discussion of the virtues of education. What does it mean to be an educator? What does it mean to become Moshe Rabbeinu, I would say? Moshe, our teacher, which has become our way of referring to him, which has a certain fondness, it has a certain affection as well as respect, Moshe Rabbeinu. We feel he's present in our lives in his humanity. He is a teacher, but he's a teacher through human means of expression, not just through the authoritative transmission of God's laws. Suddenly he goes personal. And in this state of things, what we have, and there's an extraordinary comparison made by a French essayist and thinker called Roland Barthes, B-A-R-T-H-E-S. And he says this, he says, the teacher talking away in front of the class, talk, silent class, which is what Moshe is doing, is like the patient in psychoanalysis talking away to a silent analyst. Now, if you haven't this, you may know from your reading that that is the basic structure that Freud thought of and that Lacan carried on in a different way. A sense of craziness, in a way. It's crazy. There you are, just talking without any feedback. And there is this blank screen. I think talking of screens. There is this blank screen which Freud advises the analyst to make his face like a blank screen, not to show reaction. And what happens then is the kind of pressure on the talking patient to say more and to say more. And then willy-nilly, suddenly things come out which are very real, but which you wouldn't choose to say necessarily from a dignified, masterful point of view. Dignity and mastery are not the order of the day. And that's why Moshe becomes Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm suggesting, that what he succeeds in the end, does he succeed? We'll ask the question. What he succeeds in, hopefully, is that the people will somehow find in themselves a kind of uneasiness about Moshe, not thinking that they've got him, neatly in their back pocket. Oh yes, he left all these writings. We know exactly what he wanted. We know exactly what God wanted. The ability to do something very different, to be curious, to look at the text and say, but what does that really mean? It doesn't seem quite to make sense. If I hear it in a certain way, and I realize that the pshat just won't do. Right? That's my own prejudice. But it's really a matter of better listening. It's better listening that understands there have to be other levels as well, because one has an unconscious. Human beings have an unconscious. And especially when Moshe personally addresses people, his unconscious has to be in somewhere enacted. And that teaches the people something about the space that now is demanded of them, that they are asked to enter into, to reach out towards that question. What did Moshe really mean when he said, yes? What did my mother really mean when she said such and such 40 years ago? God didn't give you a heart to know and eyes to see and ears to hear until this day. And if you glance at the final source here, if you glance at number 7, you can see in the Babylonian Talmud, sometimes Moshe didn't hint to the people. Moshe hinted to the people only after 40 years of walking in the desert. It was only then that he hinted to the people that really they have been remiss. Right? It's only at the end of the story that they didn't have a knowing heart. And then Rava says very powerfully, he says sometimes it takes 40 years for a student to understand what his teacher was saying. Now that's a certain way of being a student. It starts off with obtuseness. It starts off with childishness and taking the surface meaning as the only meaning, and taking notes, this is what the teacher said. And then as the years go by, and perhaps it takes just those 40 years, is the time it takes the embryo to develop. 40 is a midrashic magic number, to develop. And to develop to a point where one can begin to understand the different layers on which the teacher was speaking. And now I begin to understand what he meant. And the triumphant sense one has there. On the one hand, it's triumphant because I feel that I now know more than I did before, that my capacities have changed. On the other hand, it's a little bitter because of my limitations. All this time I've been so very limited. How blind could I be? And even now, maybe I haven't really gone all the way. I haven't really found everything there is to find. You surely haven't, in fact. Ad hayom hazeh, until this day. And this day, does it mean till today and you're still obtuse? That would be a very doleful reading. Or does it mean today you begin to see it? You begin to have a knowing heart. And that's the reading that Rashi chooses. This day I understand. This is what he says. Ata hivanti. Now I understand. Listen to that. I understand that you really do desire and cling to God. That in other words, my view all along that you really weren't up to it. All along, I felt you were very obtuse in your religious lives, in your lives with God. You were very slow to get things. Now I realize that under the surface, you always had a passion. So what you have here, and I think we'll have to finish with this, what you have here is the dawning of a new way of listening, not only on the part of the people, but on the part of Moshe himself. He says, Atahivanti. That, of course, what I'm doing is something that's against the rules. I'm using this reading of the word to understand, this time as it occurs in Rashi. That is, Rashi uses those words. Text doesn't use it, of Moshe. And it's as if Rashi senses that if the people have grown in understanding, then Moshe is in some way implicated in this. That he was implicated in their blindness and in their deafness, because he couldn't speak to them really. and he's implicated in their growth and in their openness. And so there is a sense of actually having, in some real sense, entered a new world. But it can only be entered through the bitter sweetness of what it is to have a human life. And then to speak from the place of ignorance, from the place of having it in many ways out of joint, of incoherence, of not knowing how to put things together. There is no other honest place to begin from if one wants to know. And one has to fully be there before one can begin somewhere to grow towards, to reach out towards some kind of perhaps difficult knowledge, some kind of knowledge that will ultimately open up some kind of a new world. We're out of time, and I want to just finish by wishing you all, those who I can see and those who I can't see, a year in which something new begins to grow from this very hard year, not to put it more strongly, that we have lived through. For some of us, it's just been a hard year, and for some of us, it's been much, much worse than that, much, much worse. And my heart is with, as much as I can, with that disrupted life of so many people, and the hope that something will now succeed, will come out of this, which will include this awareness that we have now, and embrace it and bring it into a larger perception, a way of seeing the world differently. Chag Sameach, Shana Tova.